Good morning. It's Friday, and this is day 5 of the Black Man Who Reads Aloud, the Black Bloggers, Black History Month. As I go into the Equal Justice Initiative, Reconstruction in America, Chapter 5, Reconstructions End, because Reconstruction did end in 1877 with the compromise that elected Rutherford B. Hayes as he defeated Samuel Tilden, and the North basically gave the South back their lands, their people, the slavery, the institutions, everything. Chapter 5, Reconstructions End. When Congress intervened by its Reconstruction measures to defeat the reactionary programs of the South, there swept over that section of a crime storm of devastating fury. Lawlessness and violence filled the land, and terror stalked abroad by day, and it burnt and murdered by night. In this chapter, we will cover Reconstruction versus Southern redemption, judicial and political abandonment, redemption wins, a vanishing hope. Organized white resistance to black freedom and citizenship used violence and terror to render the promise of Reconstruction a nightmare. Remember when Dr. King had his dream on August the 28th, 1963, and Malcolm called it Black America's Nightmare? And then a couple of years later, in 1967, Dr. King said he had integrated into a burning house. Well, this was the same story, but even worse. Though black communities and their supporters worked to fight that terror and ensure the success of Reconstruction, the era's promise was ultimately destroyed and abandoned through political and legal sabotage. Reconstruction versus Southern redemption. Congressional efforts to document and respond to raging anti-black violence in the former Confederacy culminated in an effort to gather facts about the scope of the problem. From April 1871 to February 1872, 21 congressmen composing the Joint Select Committee to inquire into the conditions of affairs in the late insurrectory states traveled through the South to investigate escalating racial violence in the region. These proceedings yielded 13 volumes of first-hand testimony from black and white witnesses, including state officials, former Confederate soldiers, formerly enslaved people, clergymen, teachers, and other community members. At the Alabama hearings, John Childers, a black laborer living in Sumter County, reported that he had been confronted by a white mob, struck in the head with a gun, and threatened with additional harm if he voted for a pro-civil rights candidate. Mr. Childers tearfully recounted the brutal beating that his daughter received at the hands of her white employer after the man's child replaced the hat while in her care. Just 9 years old, Mr. Childers' daughter died of her injuries 8 days later. I came home the 4th of July. I found my little daughter at home. She had run away from the place where she was abused. But I saw the rest of the children playing in the yard, and she was in the door sitting there, and I thought that was strange because she was a mighty playful chap. And I asked, "What are you sitting here for?" And she says, "Pat, Mr. Jones beat me nearly to death." The witness weeping. She pulled up her coat here and showed me, "Look here, Papa, where he cut me, and where there were great lashes on her thighs as long as my finger." I buried her with them. Federal efforts to address the racial violence, including this type of congressional inquiry, federal military occupation of southern states, and the operations of the Freedmen's Bureau. At the time, a growing group of African American leaders also worked to speak out against racial violence of the era and agitate for meaningful help. Many black people, including the formerly enslaved, emerged as community leaders in the first years after emancipation, when black citizenship was established and the fate of black Americans was a national issue. Black political and social leaders were among those most often targeted for mob attack and murder. Those who chose to run for office or organize communities knowingly put their lives at risk. Many Reconstruction era leaders served as ministers or teachers, and black churches and schools were also targets of violence. The Union League, a black-led organization, was founded in 1863 to support African American participation in politics, education, and social efforts. The League's meetings had to happen covertly due to the threats by the Klu Klux Klan and the other white supremacist groups. By 1868, the League's participation declined in the face of growing Klan violence, but in its brief existence, the Union League successfully introduced thousands of black citizens to the American political process and demonstrated black people's willingness to risk great harm to work towards their own advancement. While federal officials made weak attempts to combat racial violence and black communities tried to organize in their own defense, former Confederates worked to parlay violent terror into renewed political power. Redemption was the political movement to restore white supremacy as the fundamental institution in the South. Its advocates, called redeemers, were white businessmen and wealthy planters who had enslaved black people just a few years earlier. Immediately following the Confederate defeat, the federal government imposed restrictions that rendered these white men unable to vote, hold office, or otherwise exercise control over the lands and governments they had once ruled. Meanwhile, free black men were now voting and holding office as representatives of their state. Redeemers staunchly opposed the progressive politicians who achieved adoption of the Reconstruction Amendments and passage of the Civil Rights Act. But this was not merely a political dispute. Forced to rejoin the Union and accept the abolition of slavery, Redeemers remained most loyal to the doctrine of white supremacy and adamantly opposed to anything that threatened its continuation. This ideology, rooted in the physiological foundations of slavery and the anti-black racism, was bitterly antagonized by black political representation and suffrage. Redeemers began an unrelenting campaign to intimidate black voters, disrupt pro-civil rights political gatherings, undermine elections, and return power back to white leaders who supported the former Confederates' ideals. Redeemers also supported and legitimized the racial violence committed by paramilitary organizations like the Klu Klux Klan. Judicial and political abandonment. In response to the growing racial terror in the South, Congress passed a series of enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871, the broadest being the Klu Klux Klan Act of 1871. These laws empowered the federal government to prosecute civil rights violations as crimes and authorized individuals to seek redress in federal court when their civil rights were violated. Southern white leaders, echoing earlier arguments used to justify slavery, decried the Ku Klux Klan Act as the crowning act of centralization and consolidation that brushed away at once and finally the all-state machinery and local authority and substituted in their place the federal bayonets. In their view, a federal action to punish racial violence was an unjustified intrusion on state authority, even if state governments were doing nothing to combat the racial violence themselves. The United States Supreme Court ultimately agreed with the white Southerners' argument, issuing opinions that severely undermined the legal architecture of Reconstruction. While black American voters faced murder and terror, the court was more concerned that this federal law might fetter and degrade the state governments. From the nation's founding to 1865, the Supreme Court had struck down just 2 congressional acts as unconstitutional. Between 1865 and 1872, the court did so 12 times. The court's intervention was orchestrated by John Archibald Campbell, a white lawyer and former Supreme Court justice who had voted with the majority in the 1857 Dred Scott decision that held that black people could not be American citizens. Campbell, himself a slave owner, later left the bench to help lead the Confederate States of America. He bitterly opposed Reconstruction after the war's end. When Louisiana's Reconstruction legislature implemented regulations consolidating New Orleans slaughterhouses into one location outside the city, Campbell saw an opportunity to rob the 13th and 14th Amendment of their purpose. He filed a suit on behalf of a group of white butchers and argued that the Louisiana law forbidding slaughterhouses within the city limits interfered with the butchers' livelihoods in violation of the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery and the 14th Amendment's Privilege and Immunities Clause. By bringing cases based in fact unrelated to the Reconstruction Amendment core purposes, Campbell hoped to use the laws as a weapon to bring about Reconstruction's ultimate demise. The court obliged. After consolidating Campbell and several other cases into the slaughterhouse cases in 1872, it held that the 14th Amendment protected only the privileges and immunities conferred by national citizenship, a narrow category of rights mostly irrelevant to the struggles facing Southern black people. The majority reasoned that the rights derived from a person's state citizenship were enforceable only in state courts, which were increasingly dominated by the Redeemers. The slaughterhouse cases marked the 13th time in 7 years that the Supreme Court struck down federal laws designed to protect freemen, and the decision greatly limited the 14th Amendment's reach. In a dissenting opinion, Justice Stephen J. Field predicted that the amendment would be left a vain and idle enactment. At the same time, the Congress and new President Ulysses S. Grant began to retreat from other federal efforts to protect black rights and lives. Several Southern racial violence became an increasingly divisive issue, and a politically weakened President Grant grew reluctant to intervene. Mississippi's Reconstruction Governor Delbert Ames, a Union military veteran and a transplant from the North, requested federal troops to suppress intense white violence targeting black communities through state elections. President Grant refused and instead sent an exaggerated letter encouraging Ames to broker a peace agreement between the state militia and the white mobs, explaining that the whole public are tired out with these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South. Congress and President Grant also took affirmative steps to empower former members of the Confederate Army. The Amnesty Act of 1872, ending office-holding disqualifications for most Confederate leaders and other civil and military officials who had rebelled against the Union. Even before 1872, the federal government had given up on restricting the voting rights of former Confederate troops. But by the time of the 1872 amnesty, the vast majority of white former Confederate leaders in the South were also free to own land, hold office, and make laws. Only a few hundred Confederate leaders remained under restriction. The very same people who had so recently fought to maintain white supremacy and retain slavery were now well positioned to seize control of their state governments, create laws and policies to suppress the new civil rights of black people, and enable continued racial terror. Born into slavery in 1836, Representative Jefferson Long was elected Georgia's first black representative in 1870. He became the first black person to speak on the House when he urged rejection of the Amnesty Act. Mr. Speaker, I propose, as a man raised as a slave, my mother a slave before me, and my ancestry slaves as far back as I can trace them. If this House removes the disabilities of disloyal men by modifying the test oath, I venture to prophesy you will again have trouble from the very same men who gave you trouble before. The act passed, and Representative Long's unheeded warnings became reality. Redemption wins. Empowered by the Amnesty Act, Confederate veterans regained political control, espousing white supremacist rhetoric and employing terror tactics of intimidation. Confederate Colonel James Milton Smith was elected Georgia governor in 1872 and returned the state to white supremacist rule. vowed to undo the influence of a post-Reconstruction misrule and quickly partnered with the like-minded legislature to roll back gains that black Georgians had accumulated under the Reconstruction administrations. In Virginia, a few months after his 1874 inauguration as governor, former Confederate General James L. Kemper delivered an address to the General Assembly outlining the racial regime he planned to construct. Henceforth, let it be understood of all that the political equality of the races is settled, and the social equality of the races is settled impossibly. Let it be understood of all that any organized attempt on the part of the weaker and relatively diminishing race to dominate the domestic governments is the wildest chimera of political insanity. Let each race settle down in the final resignation to the lot which it has exorably consigned it. The same year, large numbers of white supremacist candidates were elected to office in Alabama, largely due to the use of violence, threats, terror, and fraud. In Efula, Alabama, a branch of the paramilitary White League waged a bloody attack against black voters to ensure white supremacist victory at the ballot box. The Alabama election of 1874 restored former Confederate leaders to legislative and executive authority, ending Reconstruction in the state, and elected Governor George Houston. He led a political effort to reverse the aims of Reconstruction in Alabama and restore the dominance of the great governing race, the white people of the land. By 1875, state legislature was dominated by white supremacists who called a constitutional convention to amend Alabama's Reconstruction Constitution ratified just 7 years earlier. The 1861 convention's 100 delegates had included 18 black men and 79 white supporters of Reconstruction's aims. Delegates to the 1875 convention, by contrast, included 80 Redeemers, 7 Independents, and just 12 Reconstructionists, 4 of whom were black. Among the provisions the new Constitution ratified with more than 70% of the vote mandated separate schools for the children of citizens of African descent. With many Southern governments redeemed, white violence against black people intensified. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented at least 12 large-scale massacres in Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, Mississippi, and South Carolina between 1872 and 1876, many of which targeted politically active African Americans. On Easter Sunday in 1873, 300 white people attacked a courthouse in Colfax, Louisiana, after black protesters peacefully challenged fraudulent election results. Even after the outnumbered black crowd waved white flags of surrender, the assault continued, and scores of unarmed black men who sought shelter in the courthouse or attempted to flee were shot and killed. Approximately 50 African Americans who survived the afternoon of bloodshed were taken prisoner and later executed by the white militia. As many as 150 African Americans were killed in the massacre, described as the bloodiest single act of carnage in all of Reconstruction. Federal prosecutors in Louisiana brought criminal charges against members of the Colfax mobs under the Enforcement Act. Despite overwhelming evidence, one defendant was acquitted and the jurors failed to reach verdicts against any others. Before a retrial, the defense challenged whether the federal court had jurisdiction to hear the case at all, arguing for the first time that the Enforcement Act was unconstitutional as applied to private persons who are not state actors. The court allowed the trial to proceed, but when 3 defendants were convicted of conspiracy, the judge ruled the Enforcement Act unconstitutional and dismissed the indictments, initiating an appeal to the Supreme Court. In the United States versus Crunch Act, decided on March 27, 1876, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's dismissal and ruled that the 15th Amendment protected citizens only from state action and not from violent attacks committed by private individuals. This ruling rendered the Enforcement Act a dead letter and severely limited the 14th Amendment. African Americans in the South were now at the mercy of white terrorists who had no recourse in federal courts as long as the terrorists remained private actors. Federal protection disappeared almost immediately after the Crunch Act decision. The Justice Department dropped 179 Enforcement Act prosecutions in Mississippi alone. Black people had few federal troops to run to for protection, as the government had already withdrawn troops from all the southern cities except Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Violence grew more frequent and bolder. White mobs committed attacks on African Americans undisguised and in broad daylight. Black people dreaded the withdrawal of the few remaining federal troops. In 1876, when a politically beleaguered President Grant decided not to seek a third term, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes ran against the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Hayes, an abolitionist and a Union Army veteran injured in the Civil War, lost the popular vote to Tilden, a former New York governor, supported by the majority of southern states, but the electoral college results were disputed, sparking a contentious congressional debate and threatening regional political conflict. In January of 1977, a bipartisan electoral commission created to resolve the election contrary voted to award the popular vote and the contested electoral college vote to Hayes, giving him a narrow victory over Tilden. In exchange, Hayes agreed to use his presidential authority to withdraw all the remaining troops from the South. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction as part of a political deal with no inquiry into whether its goals had been accomplished. Within 2 months of taking office, President Hayes ended federal troops' role in Southern politics. Southern Redeemers rejoiced at Reconstruction's demise. This is the centennial crow that our old game rooster, who has been cooped up for 12 years, now sings in clarion tones. We can now shout and join our anthems of joy and glory with the victory of our time-honored old party. Hallelujah, the white supremacist John W. Burgess exalted. The white man of the South need now have to further fear that the federal powers will ever again give themselves over to the vain imagination of the political equality of man, of vanishing hope. A presence of federal troops in the South during the Reconstruction era acted as a penetrable dam, holding back some of the violence, political suppression, and the racist rhetoric of those intent on restoring white supremacist rule. Just 12 years after emancipation, the dam vanished. A vast majority of black people in America still lived in the South, where without federal protection they were at the mercy of the same white officials who had very recently waged a war to keep them in bondage. In the words of Henry Adams, a black man living in Louisiana, the whole South, every state in the South, had just got into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves. On the defeat of Reconstruction, the nation offered a solemn assessment. The Negro would disappear from the field of national politics. Henceforth, the nation, as a nation, we will have nothing to do with him. For millions of black men and women and children, the abandonment foretold a grim future. The decision to remove soldiers from the South led to the restoration of white supremacy and voting through the systemic and disenfranchisement of black people, virtually accomplishing over the next 8 decades what slavery had accomplished in the country's first 8 decades. Reconstruction would not remove the original stain of slavery so much as smear it onto the other parts of the Constitution's fabric. The legal and military abandonment that came with the fall of Reconstruction was devastating. It threatened many of the social and political gains black people had managed to make amidst the terror and violence that followed the Civil War. In a new era of white supremacy, as a new era of white supremacy took hold in the South, education remained a priority among African Americans, but assessing education became more difficult in the face of growing hostility and dwindling resources. White employers fired black workers for attending school, and unchecked white supremacist groups like the Klu Klux Klan burned down school buildings and beat and murdered students and teachers. Reconstruction efforts to educate freemen had established the South's first system of universal public education, but the continuation of that system now relied on the support of Southern white leaders, many of whom remained convinced that black education was wasteful and even dangerous. In many ways, the 1881 launch of the Tuskegee Institute, representing a continuing black commitment to educational achievement. The remarks Alabama Governor and former Confederate William C. Oates gave at a Tuskegee graduation ceremony in the 1890s illustrates the white officials' hostility toward black education in the post-Reconstruction South. I want to give you niggas a few words of plain talk and advice, Oates began, denouncing the previous speaker. No such addresses as you have listened to is going to do you any good. It's going to spoil you. You might as well understand that this is a white man's country, and as far as the South is concerned, and we're going to make you keep your place. Understand that. I have nothing else to say. Reconstruction's end greatly impeded black economic and political advancement, with the federal lawmakers and courts disinterested in enforcing black people's constitutional rights to equality and fair treatment. Discriminatory laws and lending practices barred black people from land ownership for decades. By 1910, for example, only 40% of white farmers in Georgia were land owners. More than 40% were land owners in Georgia, whites, compared to just 7% of the state's black farmers. Southern state governments quickly went to work altering their constitutions and to disenfranchise black citizens and to codify racial hierarchy. From 1885 to 1908, all 11 former Confederate states rewrote their constitutions to restrict voting rights using poll taxes, literacy tests, and felon disenfranchisement. After Louisiana post-Reconstruction Constitution imposed these restrictions on voting rights, the number of black registered voters dropped from 130,000 during Reconstruction to just 5,000 by 1900 and just 1,000 by 1904. In the words of John B. Knox, an Alabama lawyer and president of the state's 1901 Constitutional Convention, if we would have white supremacy, we must establish it by law, not by force or fraud. Local and state laws combined to trap black people in a form of second-class citizenship by mandating segregation in schools, trains, buses, motels, and restaurants, outlawing interracial marriage, authorizing economic exploitation through convict leasing and mandatory labor contracts, and barring black people from holding public office, voting in elections, or serving on juries. But perhaps the most devastating effect of Reconstruction's failure was the deadly violence that continued to plague black communities for decades. The premature withdrawal of federal troops unleashed a bold wave of violence that overwhelmed the few remaining protective structures and submitted black people in an inferior economic, social, and political position, an era of second slavery. With the last meaningful layer of federal protection moved and the Supreme Court's tolerance of extrajudicial violence, legal oppression, and racial terror lynchings became the defining features of black life in America for the next 80 years. Over the century that this racial caste system reigned, lynching became the weapon of choice and a technique of enforcing racial exploitation. Between Reconstruction and World War II, thousands of African Americans were lynched, often in public acts of torture that traumatized black people across the country. Reconstruction is the prologue to that story. The thousands of black people killed between 1865 and 1877 foreshadowed the bloodshed that would persist as the ideology of white supremacy continued to strangle the hope for equality. And that is chapter 5 of the of Reconstruction in America, violence during the Reconstruction period. We will be picking up chapter 6. We will be picking up chapter 6 on Saturday, and chapter 6 is a truth that needs telling. Have a great day, and thank you.